This video is a review of American history from 1789 to 1865. We'll be starting the information for our course, which picks up after 1865, but I just wanted to go over some of the key events that you're supposed to learn in 8th grade, and hopefully you remember a lot of these. So here we have this map of present-day United States, and it indicates which areas were acquired at specific times in our history. So if you think back to Revolutionary times, the 13 British colonies, all here hugging the east coast of what's now the United States, are going to gain their independence, and the United States of America will include these 13 states. And over the course of the next 100 years or so, the new Americans are going to continually push west. As they push west, Native American groups in their way, unfortunately, will be pushed aside, oftentimes killed. This territory down here used to be Mexico. Half of Mexico was taken in the Mexican War in 1846. Thomas Jefferson, who many of you are probably aware, under his presidency, the Louisiana Territory was acquired from Napoleon in 1803. That is this huge chunk of land up here. And also during the Mexican War, the Oregon Territory was settled. This land was also claimed by Great Britain, and they agreed to divide the territory with this boundary right here. So, purpose of this video is to get you acclimated to some of the key events that happened in American history from the time of the Constitution in 1789 until the end of the Civil War in 1865. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these presidents: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. These guys were all revolutionary leaders. Jefferson famously wrote the Declaration of Independence. Madison's considered the father of the Constitution. Adams was on the committee with Jefferson. Washington, of course, was the general for the colonial army. And then Adams and Jackson will play prominent roles in the next generation of the United States of America. We'll particularly talk a lot about Andrew Jackson. War of 1812, which you'll never guess what year it began, 1812. The United States is going to fight the British for a second time, and many historians say this war was a bit of a draw. The British caused a lot of damage here in America, even burning the White House down. The Americans invaded Canada, which was British territory, burning down their capital. General Andrew Jackson famously won the Battle of New Orleans, even though the war was technically over. People didn't know it yet, in 1815, bringing the war to a complete end. But as a result of the war, the British began recognizing the United States as a country that they would respect. The Americans were upset with the British policy of impressment, where American sailors were captured by the British and forced into the British Navy. So this will be the last time the United States fights the British, and in modern times they've been a close ally with the United States. The issue of slavery was a huge issue at the time of our nation's founding. The founding fathers kind of pushed off the issue so that the country could come together. And in 1820, as the country seemed to be growing into two separate areas, the North, which was gaining traction to be against slavery, and the South, which slavery was, the foundation of their economy, and they would face economic collapse without the institution of slavery. The compromise in 1820 is going to kind of smooth things over for the time being, and what was agreed was Missouri became a new slave state, Maine became a free state in the North, and any territory north of the parallel 3630, let me go back and show you. So all of this territory from this line across, any future state would become a slave state down here, and any future state north of the line would be a free state. So that's going to kind of keep things at bay temporarily. But this issue of slavery would not go away. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which was passed by Congress, which authorized Native American groups east to the Mississippi River to be forcibly removed from their homes. Even though the Native Americans had won a court case in the Supreme Court guaranteeing the protection of their land, Jackson ignored it. And then later, under the presidency of Martin Van Buren, when the Native Americans were actually removed from their land, it was one of the saddest events in American history. Known as the Trail of Tears, thousands and thousands of Native Americans forced 800 miles to the Oklahoma Territory. Many of them died along the way of exhaustion and starvation and all kinds of ailments, forced at bayonet point by the American Army. This push to spread from sea to shining sea was known as the idea of manifest destiny, or the God-given belief that the Americans had the right to any land in their path to the Pacific Ocean. It's a racist point of view. This was furthered with the annexation of Texas. Texas had broken away from Mexico, and the United States took Texas on as part of their territory. And then the United States instigated a war with Mexico, and as a result, America was able to take California, most of the present-day southwest United States. Half of Mexico was stolen from them. The very next year, gold was discovered in California, which made the United States incredibly rich, and it's going to push in more Western settlers. And of course, that slavery issue, which is not going away, is really at the forefront now. What about all that new territory? Will these become slave states? Will they become free states? And this was a huge chunk of land, everything from California across and all the way down. Huge question mark. What will become of these states? So the country is pushing further and further towards an eventual war in which the country will split apart. So in 1850, another compromise is reached, and again, dealing with the slavery issue, California comes in as a new free state, and anytime you have a compromise, you have to make the other side happy. So a strict fugitive slave law was passed and enforced throughout the country. So laws protected slave owners to reclaim slaves that had run away to the north. It even allowed free blacks to be captured and brought into the South and forced into slavery. It also opened up the idea of slavery issues in new territories, what's going to occur there. And a couple of years later, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe from Connecticut, which really opened Americans' eyes to the evils of slavery. All right, so here is a map of the United States in 1850. We have all of this unsettled territory. What's going to happen? Will they become free? Will they become slave? The idea of popular sovereignty was introduced as well, which stipulated that people in the Kansas Territory and Nebraska, they could choose whether they wanted to be slave or free. But of course, this was a direct violation of the Louisiana Purchase, because again, remember this territory is above that 3630 line, which is right here. So the country was destined for a war at this time. As a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which enraged anti-slavery people in the North, the Republican Party was born. And the goal was to stop the spread of slavery. That was the goal of the Republican Party. Didn't mean they wanted to end slavery immediately, but it meant that any future states would not have slaves. Many of the Republicans were also completely against slavery and supported the abolition of slavery, but not all, including Abraham Lincoln, which we'll talk about. So Kansas was a battleground between pro and anti-slavery factions. John Brown went around and murdered, him and his band, murdered slave-owning families. Brown's also famous for the raid on Harper's Ferry, where he tried to start a slave uprising by attacking a federal arsenal, arming slaves with guns, and then he wanted to go throughout the South freeing all the slaves, but he never made it out of Harper's Ferry. The Dred Scott decision, which further is going to divide the country, involved a slave, Dred Scott, who sued for his freedom, under the idea that since his owner took him into the North to live for a couple of years, that made him free. However, he's going to lose the case, and that's going to more affirm the policy of slavery. And in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, even though he was not on the ballot in a single southern state, and that's going to usher in secession. So the first southern state to leave the country was South Carolina, and all of the states in the South soon followed. And they formed their own country. The Confederate States of America had their own president, Jefferson Davis, their own capital in Richmond, Virginia, and they're going to engage in a 4-year battle against the North. 620,000 Americans died in this war, which is just about the same number as all the other wars combined in our country's history. In 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which was a great first step towards ending slavery. And 2 years later, the North defeated the South. A week after victory for Lincoln, he was murdered by John Wilkes Booth. Later that year, the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery, and that ushered in the period of Reconstruction, a rebuilding of the South. So African Americans had protection from the federal government and from the Republicans. For the next decade, blacks were allowed to vote. They were even elected to Congress. However, in 1877, a deal was struck in which the Republicans were given the presidency and the South was allowed to have complete control of their land. And as a result, when the Northern soldiers left, segregation was enforced. So these Jim Crow laws are going to dominate for the next 100 years. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 is going to say it's okay to have segregation as long as the facilities are separate but equal. And that will not be reversed all the way until 1954, the desegregating of the public schools. So this is just a short little history of this nearly 100-year period. We will talk more about this in class.